And welcome back to the show. Of course, we're talking about the political climate, especially and particularly the African-American vote, with Dr. Sekou Franklin, Associate Professor of Political Science at MTSU. And before we took a break, Dr. Franklin, you were kind of talking about, you know, people have to kind of pay attention to what these candidates are saying and what they're talking about, and particularly the issues that matter to us and what their fixes, their solutions, their programs in relation to those. But then some would say, you know, it's a lot of talk now, but then the action and the results, what happens once those candidates get to the White House. So when you think about the past elections and what people have said they were going to do and then what they do, have those things come to action?
No. So there are a couple of things. One is voter mobilization, and then when your candidate gets in office, does your candidate do what he or she says that he or she plans to do? And in many cases, not all, but in some cases, you know, they have occurred. If you think about 2008 and Obama, he comes in office and he says that he wants to get health care done. The hidden story about health care and the Affordable Care Act, as it relates to getting something done, is that a grassroots coalition of health equity activists got together and pushed that bill through, and they have been responsible for making sure that that bill has been executed. Even to this day, as of within the last a month or so, a national coalition of civil rights organizations led by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, that coalition is still making sure that rule changes made by the HHS, that those rule changes are still holding true and dear to this issue of equity. So a lot of times what I think activists have to realize is that once you get a person in office, and even once they carry out public policy, you have to almost embed your influence in the existing infrastructure to make sure that those policies are effectively carried out, executed. So
still have to do work.
That's still going to make, yes, it's because a lot of decisions, a lot of policies, even policies that are passed, they're executed at the sub-national level, or they're executed in a bureaucratic infrastructure that's in existence. And so the ball keeps kind of rolling, even though the president gets in office and even though the president executes policy, and it doesn't stop, and activists particularly have to be operational at all parts of where the ball is rolling. So, but you know, there are some examples, I think, in which I think activists, or issues rather, the activists are pushing, have trouble getting implemented. One example for President Obama was, or is still this day, is climate change. His first 6 months in office, he got a climate change bill through the House, led in part by Nancy Pelosi. It was called Cap and Trade, and then it stalled, and then it got buried by the debate over the Affordable Care Act. When they tried to revitalize it in the next year, it was buried and defeated dramatically. He's tried to execute some climate change provisions through the EPA, and some of them have been successful. The Supreme Court has come in also and has overturned some of them. Immigration is another issue in which Obama has struggled to put together a comprehensive immigration plan that has, in some respects, upset many immigration activists, but on the other hand, some of his executive actions, executive orders have also been celebrated by immigration activists. So it just depends on a case-by-case level whether or not a president or a person who gets in office can actually fulfill or meet all the goals or demands that are put on the table during the election process.
Well, and of course it takes time. That's the reality as well. But those are some important issues that people should focus on. Immigration, you talked about environment, you talked about health. Education is always at the top of the list when we talk about things. So when you look at those issues in general, and I know people's political beliefs are different. People think different ways, I get that. But in general, what should African Americans look for when they're talking about that right kind of candidate that connects with them?
I think that they should. Well, I think African Americans should look at the people around a candidate. I just want to make sure I point that out. Okay. Who's advising the president? Who has access to the president? I think that African Americans should significantly study, not just rhetoric, but the substantive policy issues. So, for example, in this presidential elections, African Americans should look at Hillary Clinton's position on police misconduct. It's clear that the Justice Department, for example, has a high standard for bringing cases against police officers or law enforcement officials who are involved in killings of unarmed civilians. Could there be an adjustment or a change to those kinds of policies? What does Hillary Clinton say about those issues? So I think African Americans, I think it's kind of a myth that African Americans are totally drawn to symbolism or totally drawn to rhetoric. I think African Americans in particular should look at the substantive policy issues, how they attempt to go about implementing those policies as they evaluate various candidates.
One of the other things that you have taken a look at quite extensively recently, and probably for some time now, is the voting rights and issues surrounding voting rights. Now, we've had some elections in the past where things have happened and people weren't able to exercise their right to vote. So give me an update, an idea of where we stand as far as voting rights are concerned, and what issues you've been working on and focused on.
Yes. So we are operating in today's political climate in what's called what voting rights advocates call the post-Shelby versus Holder era. And Shelby versus Holder was a Supreme Court case in 2013 that effectively eliminated what's called pre-clearance, or the right for the federal government to weigh in on local electoral changes and procedures made by local governments and state governments. It was essentially the holy grail, the golden child of voting rights protections, particularly in deep southern states and other states where Native Americans and Latinos resided in. Tennessee was not one of those states covered under Shelby versus Holder, but Tennessee is still nonetheless a state where voting rights issues are extraordinarily important. In terms of the major voting rights issues that voting rights advocates are looking at today, there are several. One is the voter purge issue, particularly here in Tennessee, in which Davidson County, 19,000 voters were purged in the last 3 years for being so-called infrequent voters. Georgia also has a big, huge issue around purging that the NAACP at the national level and other organizations are looking at. Currently, the appellate court in the Atlantic Coast out of North Carolina is looking at North Carolina's voting restrictions law. That law essentially bans same-day registration. It also bans out-of-precinct voting. Both of those bans actually hurt African Americans, so that case is being heard at this point in time in the appellate court. Redistricting is a big issue. Drawing fair districts that are representative and that include African Americans has been a fundamental attack, particularly since Shelby versus Holder, from Texas on up to the East Coast, against redistricting efforts that have improved chances for African Americans to get fair representation in local governments in particular. So there's a whole range of voting issues. Voter ID is a big issue from the Southwest on up to the East Coast. These voter ID bills were pushed forward in more than a dozen states, and I believe there's at least a federal court case that pertains to voter ID issues. As you know, here in Tennessee, voter ID has been a big issue in the last 4 or 5 years. Giving people who have been formerly incarcerated the right to vote, that's also a big issue. So there's just a whole range of voting rights issues that voting rights scholars are looking at this point in time right now. Voting rights advocates, attorneys that are critical for this election. A couple of those cases that I just mentioned could come before the November 2016 election. The North Carolina one in particular. And North Carolina being a swing state, being a very critical swing state, if those voting restrictions are overturned, that could be very helpful for African Americans to essentially turn out to vote in that November election.
Dr. Franklin, full of information, obviously. If people are interested in getting in touch with you, we can get them to the MTSU website.
Absolutely.
For more information there.
Me.
And thank you so much for being with us today and talking about voting rights and these voting issues for sure. And thank you for being here. We will see you again next time.
Thank you.